Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mr. Chauke, all the way from a media high school. Today I will be presenting history, the road to the democracy. The road to the democracy. This topic is so important to our history, because without the road to the democracy, maybe today we will not have the democracy in South Africa. So before we can start, I will just I will discuss the main aspect of the essay, but it will be discussed in details when we go further. So in this essay of Road to the Democracy, we will be focusing on the change of leadership. It will be discussed in details. The F.W. de Klerk's speech, also de Klerk's decisions to release Nelson Mandela from prison. Also, we'll discuss the Sebokeng massacre. We will discuss the Grooteskier Minute. We'll also discuss the Pretoria Minute. We are going to also discuss the Val Triangle violence when IFP supporters attacked ANC supporters. We are also going to discuss CODESA. Also, we are going to discuss the white-only referendum. We are also going to talk about the CODESA 2, the collapse, which collapsed due to the disagreement between political parties. We are also going to discuss the Wipatong massacre. We are also going to discuss the Bisho massacre. We are also going to discuss the record of understanding. And then we are also going to discuss the sunset clause. We'll also discuss the Chris Hani assassination, the assassination of Chris Hani. And then we are going to discuss AWB when they stormed the meeting. And then we'll also discuss the St. James massacre. We are also going to discuss the Shell House massacre. We are also going to discuss the elections. So everything will be discussed in details when we go further. So before we can talk about the change of leadership or F.W. de Klerk's speech or the release of Nelson Mandela or the first meeting between ANC and National Party, I want us to talk about the factors that led to political parties to decide to negotiate for a democracy. So we have factors that led political parties in South Africa to negotiate for a democracy. First one, it's internal resistance against apartheid. Internal resistance against apartheid. This is where black South African, led by organizations such as ANC, protested against apartheid through strike, marches, boycott, armed resistance. And because of all this, the country became increasingly unstable. Number two, we'll check the international pressure and sanctions. We'll check the international pressure and sanctions. Here we are talking about many countries and organizations strongly criticize apartheid, meaning that like countries outside of South Africa during that time started to criticize the apartheid government in South Africa or the apartheid policies in South Africa. Also, the economic sanctions, trade restrictions, sports boycott hurt South Africans' economy and international reputation. So here we can check like many countries stopped doing business with South Africa in order to put more pressure to South African government to change the policy of apartheid. And then the third one, here we'll be talking about the economic problem. The apartheid caused a serious economic problem. How? Businesses lost money because of sanctions and unrest in South Africa. Many businesses started to lose a lot of money because of sanctions and unrest. That's where many leaders realized that the country could not continue under the apartheid. The last one, we'll check the violence and political unrest. During 1980s, there was like a widespread violence between political groups such as UDF and COSATU and the security forces, where we are talking about police officers. This made negotiations seems as the best way to avoid the civil war. They realized that if like they don't negotiate, this country might fall under the civil war. So okay, we are done now like discussing the factors that led to political parties in South Africa to negotiate for a democracy. I said internal resistance against apartheid. I talked about the international pressure and sanctions, also the economic problem within the country, also the violence and political unrest. So because of that, we had a change of leadership in South Africa. The change of leadership played an important role in bringing the democracy in South Africa. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became the new president after replacing P.W. Botha, who suffered a stroke. And then de Klerk believed that apartheid could not continue because it was causing a violent protest and economic problems in South Africa. So in other words, here, de Klerk had a different belief with the previous apartheid leaders. He saw apartheid as something that could not continue in South Africa because of apartheid was causing the violence, also the protest in South Africa, and also the economic problems. Remember, we discussed the economic problems where we talked about the sanctions. Many countries started to criticize apartheid. Many countries stopped doing business with South Africa. So because of that, de Klerk believed that apartheid could not continue because it was causing the violence, also the protest and economic problems. So this is where de Klerk realized that black people had to be included in politics because apartheid was no longer working. Also, he wanted to avoid the civil war. He wanted to avoid the civil war. You saw what happens in Angola after when Angola gained independence. So a South African government did not want that. They wanted to avoid the civil war. Also the violence between political groups and government was increasing in the country. That's where de Klerk believed that negotiations could bring peace. Let me repeat this one. Because of like de Klerk, after when de Klerk replaced P.W. Botha, he believed that apartheid could not continue because it was causing violence and protest and economic problem. So because of that, de Klerk realized that black people had to be included in the politics because apartheid was no longer working. And they also wanted to avoid civil war in South Africa. Also, the violence between political groups and government was increasing. De Klerk believes that negotiations could bring peace in South Africa. And then here we'll be discussing the de Klerk speech. The de Klerk speech, it's where de Klerk opened the parliament on the 2nd of February 1990. His speech changed the course of South African future. How? Because in his speech, he promised that he's going to unban liberations movement such as ANC and PAC and South African Communist Party. Remember, ANC and PAC and South African Communist Party got banned in 1960. So in his speech, he promised them that he's going to unban ANC, PAC, and South African Communist Party. He also promised that he's going to release all the political prisoners in South Africa. And he promised that Nelson Mandela was to be released unconditionally. This was the beginning of the end of apartheid government. And then some are saying this speech was important because it marked the beginning of the end of apartheid. It gave political parties a chance to negotiate peacefully and to work together. So I want to repeat the F.W. de Klerk speech. When de Klerk opened the parliament on the 2nd of on the 2nd of February 1990, he promised that he's going to unban ANC, PAC and South African Communist Party. The reason for him to unban ANC and PAC and South African Communist Party is because of he was ready to negotiate with the black government, or black people. Let me say black people. He was ready to negotiate with ANC and PAC, even with other liberations movement in South Africa. When he promised to release political prisoners, it's also because of he wanted to negotiate. He was committed to negotiate in South Africa. And then Nelson Mandela was also released. And then, but some are saying this was the beginning of the apartheid government. Beginning of the end of apartheid government in South Africa. And then Nelson Mandela was released unconditionally from Victor Verster prison on the 11th of February 1990. This paved the way for the negotiations between ANC and National Party to begin. Nelson Mandela, after when he was released, he met with the senior members of ANC to brief them on the upcoming negotiations. During these meetings, Nelson Mandela discussed the future of South Africa with the senior members of ANC. They spoke about the ending of apartheid peacefully. They planned how the ANC will take part in the negotiations with the government. Remember, the government is the National Party. Nelson Mandela encouraged peace, unity, and cooperation instead of using what? The violence. So Nelson Mandela, after when he was released in prison unconditionally, he met up with the senior members of ANC to brief them about the upcoming negotiations. They discussed about the future of South Africa. They spoke about ending the apartheid peacefully without using the violence. They planned on how ANC will take part in the negotiations with the government. Nelson Mandela, as a leader of ANC, he encouraged the peace, unity, and cooperation instead of using the violence. Nelson Mandela here showed a brilliant leadership and commitment to participate in the negotiations process. Before the negotiations can start, there was a violence in Sebokeng. So the ANC and National Party had to postpone the first talk because of the violence in Sebokeng. On the 11th of April 1990, 8 protesters were killed and nearly 400 were injured after a group of 50 residents held a peaceful protest against the higher rent and poor living conditions. The police opened fire on the crowd with the rubber bullet and tear gas. This had an effect on the negotiations because this event happened soon after when Nelson Mandela was released from the prison. ANC, as a political party, they were not happy about this, and then they were even ready to stop the talk for a while. But Nelson Mandela and de Klerk decided to meet very quickly to calm the situation down, also to set for a new date for the negotiations. So after Sebokeng massacre, we had a Grootetskuur minute. In the Grootetskuur minute, this was the first meeting between ANC and the National Party. This was the first meeting between ANC and the National Party. The main role players in the meeting were de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. The main aim of this meeting, it was to end the violence. Remember, this was the first ever meeting between ANC and National Party after when Nelson Mandela was released. Remember, when Nelson Mandela was released, he met up with the senior members, and then they planned on how ANC will take place in the negotiations, and then they met up for the first time at the Grootetskuur, and then the main role players here were Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. And the main aim of this meeting, it was to end the violence in the country, also to commit themselves towards a process of the negotiations. In this meeting, National Party agreed to suspend the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. They agreed that they are going to suspend the National Party as a government. They agreed that they are going to suspend the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. Also in this meeting, National Party agreed to scrap the Separate Amenities Act. Remember, when we talk about the Separate Amenities Act, this was the act which I can say promoted the separations between black and white people. For example, there were toilets for blacks, toilets for whites. There were library for blacks and then library for white people. So in this meeting, National Party agreed to scrap this act of separate amenities. Also in this meeting, the National Party agreed that they are going to release all the political prisoners. But in this meeting, ANC refused to give up the armed struggle. ANC refused to suspend armed struggle, which is Umkhondo Wesizwe. So in this meeting, the first meeting between ANC, National Party agreed to lift the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. National Party also agreed to suspend the Separate Amenities Act. They also agreed that they are going to release all the political prisoners, but ANC refused to suspend armed struggle, Umkhondo Wesizwe. But on the other hand, ANC called overseas countries to drop the boycott against South Africa. And then the next meeting was called Pretoria Minute. It was the second meeting between ANC and National Party. It was the follow-up meeting for Grooteskir Minute. So in this meeting, National Party agreed to scrap all the remaining apartheid laws, such as Bantu education, Group Act, mixed marriage prohibition. Yeah, they agreed to scrap all the remaining apartheid laws. Also in this meeting, the National Party also agreed to lift the state of emergency in KZN. Remember, in the first meeting, the National Party agreed to suspend the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. But in the second meeting, the National Party agreed to lift the state of emergency in KZN. On the other hand, ANC here agreed to suspend the armed struggle Umkhondo Wesizwe. The reason that I'm saying on the other hand is because of, like, in the first meeting, ANC refused to suspend Umkhondo Wesizwe. But in the second meeting between ANC and National Party, here ANC agreed to suspend the armed struggle, which is Umkhondo Wesizwe. And then in this meeting, both political parties, which is ANC and National Party, they agreed to release all the political prisoners. They agreed to release all the political prisoners. And then both sides agreed to continue peacefully negotiations for the democracy. So to summarize this one, I said this was the second meeting this was the second meeting between ANC and National Party. In this meeting, the National Party agreed that they are going to scrap all the remaining apartheid laws. Also, the National Party agreed to lift the state of emergency in KZN. Because of, like, in the first meeting, they agreed to lift the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. So on the other hand, ANC here agreed to suspend the armed struggle Umkhondo Wesizwe. And then here they also agreed that they are going to release all the political prisoners. In this meeting, ANC and National Party agreed to continue peacefully negotiations for the democracy. The next one. After when ANC and National Party met for the second time, IFP hostel resident attacked ANC supporters in the Transvaal Triangle. So in the Valley Triangle, there were a violent clash between ANC and between IFP and ANC supporters. Supporters of Inkatha Freedom of Party living in the hostel attacked supporters of African National Congress. Remember, Inkatha Freedom of Party, the leader, Mangosuthu, was against the negotiations. He was against the negotiations. So they were trying in all means to disturb the negotiations. So for them to disturb the negotiations, they attacked ANC members in Val Triangle. And then they've managed to kill 30 people in the attack. And this violence made the political talk more difficult. And then Nelson Mandela and de Klerk allowed the negotiations to continue, even when IFP tried to disturb the negotiations. So to go back to this one, as I said, there were a violence in Val where IFP clashed with ANC supporters. The supporters of Inkatha Freedom of Party living in the hostel, they attacked the supporters of African National Congress. And then 30 people lost their lives in the attack. And then the violence made political talks even more difficult. But because of this, Nelson Mandela did not stop. Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, they were committed for the negotiations, and then they allowed the negotiations process to continue. And then Codesa 1, this was the first major meeting to discuss the democratic South Africa. Codesa 1 was the first major meeting to discuss the democracy in South Africa. Remember ANC and National Party met at the Grooteskuur Minute. They met also in the Pretoria Minute. But Codesa 1 was the first major meeting to discuss the democracy. Why are we saying this was the first major meeting to discuss the democracy in South Africa? It's because of here, there were 19 political parties attended to discuss the future of South Africa. Remember, in the first meeting and second meeting, it was only ANC and National Party. But here, 19 political parties attended Codesa 1 to discuss the future of South Africa. That is why they are saying that Codesa 1 was the first major meeting to discuss the democracy in South Africa. So 19 political parties met to discuss the future of South Africa, but PAC and CP did not attend Codesa 1. The reason that PAC and CP did not attend Codesa 1 is because they did not agree with the process of negotiations. CP was against the negotiations. They wanted apartheid to continue. PAC was also against the negotiations because they believe that black people cannot negotiate with white people. South Africa belongs to African. So PAC and CP were not present as they did not agree with the process of negotiations. IFP leader Buthelezi did not attend the Codesa 1. IFP leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi did not attend the Codesa 1, but they sent someone to represent IFP. PAC, CP, and IFP, they tried to block the process of negotiations, but ANC and National Party proposed the declaration of intent. Let me go back. I said Codesa 1 was the major meeting to discuss the democracy in South Africa, whereby 19 political parties met to discuss the South Africans' future. And the reason that Codesa 1 was the first major meeting is because of here there were 19 political parties involved. But at the Grooteskuur Minute and Pretoria Minute, it was only ANC and National Party. But here at Codesa 1, 19 political parties attended the meeting to discuss the future of South Africa. I also said PAC and CP did not attend Codesa 1 because of they did not agree with the process of negotiations. IFP leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi did not attend the Codesa 1, but the party sent someone to represent IFP. Even though PAC, NCP, and IFP tried to block the process of negotiations, National Party and ANC, they proposed the Declaration of Intent. So what is the Declaration of Intent? When we talk about the Declaration of Intent, it's where political parties agreed, all the political parties, they agreed to work together towards the democratic South Africa. Here they promised to solve the problem through peaceful negotiations without using violence. They also agreed to respect the human rights and equality. They supported the idea of the new constitution. Let me go back. ANC and National Party proposed the Declaration of Intent. So in the Declaration of Intent, political parties signed to agree that they are going to work together towards the democratic South Africa. They promised that they are going to solve the problem through peaceful negotiations. They agreed that to respect the human rights and equality. They supported the idea of the new constitution. And it was signed, the Declaration of Intent was signed by 17 political parties, including ANC and National Party. Out of 19 political parties, IFP and Botswana did not sign. Remember, 19 political parties attended CODESA 1, but only 17 political parties signed the Declaration of Intent. IFP did not sign, Botswana did not sign the Declaration of Intent. But just because of many political parties signed the Declaration of Intent, it allowed the negotiations to continue. To summarize this, CODESA 1 was the first major meeting to discuss the democratic South Africa, whereby 19 political parties attended CODESA 1 to discuss the future of South Africa. But PAC and CP did not attend. The reason that they did not attend is because of they did not agree with the process of negotiations, meaning that they were against the negotiations. IFP leader Buthelezi did not attend, but they sent someone to represent the party at CODESA 1. Even though PAC and CP and IFP tried to block the process of negotiations, ANC and National Party, they proposed the Declaration of Intent. So when we talk about Declaration of Intent, this is the document whereby political parties signed, whereby they agreed to work together towards a democratic South Africa. They proposed to solve the problem through peaceful negotiations. They agreed to respect the human rights and equality. They also supported the idea of the new constitution. Here, out of 19 political parties, 17 political parties signed the Declaration of Intent. IFP and Botswana did not sign the Declaration of Intent. And then the Declaration of Intent allowed the negotiations to continue. And then after the CODESA 1, de Klerk proposed the white-only referendum. After CODESA 1 was a success. But straight after the CODESA 1, de Klerk, as the president of South Africa or the leader of National Party, he proposed the white-only referendum. The reason that he proposed the white-only referendum is because after the negotiation started, the National Party began to lose support, especially amongst white supporters. So de Klerk called a white-only referendum to test white support for reforms. Here de Klerk wanted to check whether if white people are supporting his reforms or not. So he wanted to know whether if white people, he wanted to know if white voters supported the ending of apartheid and the continuing negotiations with ANC. So let me just try to explain this one. F.W. de Klerk, when he called the white-only referendum, he wanted to check whether if white people are supporting him or not. Also, he wanted to check whether if white people are supporting the reforms. Which reforms? The ending of apartheid. So at the white-only referendum, only white voters were allowed to take part. They were asked whether they support the reforms process started by de Klerk, including the ending of apartheid and negotiating with the groups like ANC. So at the white-only referendum, white voters were asked whether if they support the reforms. Which reforms? The ending of apartheid, negotiating with ANC. But majority of white voters voted yes, meaning that they were supporting the ending of what? Of apartheid, and they were also supporting what? The process of negotiations. So here some people can say, yes, we understand that 68% people voted yes, but we still had 32% who voted no. But majority count, majority of white people voted yes, meaning that they were supporting de Klerk to end apartheid, also to continue with the negotiations with ANC and other liberations movement. Because of like majority of white people voted yes, it gave de Klerk a strong support from white voters to continue with his reforms. It shows that many white voters, many white South Africans accepted a change. Which change that we are talking about here? We are talking about the ending of what? The ending of apartheid. So let me also summarize the white-only referendum again. Because of like National Party was losing support, more especially to white voters, de Klerk called the white-only referendum to test if white people are supporting his reforms or not. So only white people were allowed to vote. So they were asked whether if they are supporting the reforms of what? Of ending what? The apartheid, also to allow National Party to negotiate with ANC and other liberations movement. So majority of white people voted yes. This meant most white voters supported the ending of apartheid and supporting National Party to continue with the negotiations. Because of like majority of white people voted yes, it gave a de Klerk a support to continue with the reforms, and it shows that many white South Africans accepted the change. After white-only referendum, we had CODESA 2. CODESA 2 was the second round of the talk for a democratic South Africa. CODESA 2 failed in 1992. The reason that CODESA 2 failed is because political parties could not agree on the important issue on how South Africa should be governed after what? The apartheid. Remember, CODESA 1 was a success because of like many political parties signed the declaration of intent. After CODESA 1, after when CODESA 1 was a success, let me continue. CODESA 1 was a success, and then now they had CODESA 2. CODESA 2 was the second round of the talk for the democratic South Africa, but CODESA 2 failed in 1992. The reason that CODESA 2 failed is because political parties could not agree on the important issue about how South Africa should be governed after the apartheid. The disagreement about the majority rule, the African National Congress wanted decisions in the new government to be based on the majority rule, but the National Party wanted minority parties to have a stronger power to block the decisions. They could not agree on how the new constitution will be made. So here ANC wanted a majority rule. National Party wanted what? A power sharing. When we talk about majority rule, it's like whenever whichever the party that will get 50 plus, that will be the party that will set any rules in the country. But National Party wanted a new government of power sharing, like a government of unity where many political parties form one government. So also the power sharing disputes, National Party wanted a power sharing government for many years, even after the apartheid. So National Party wanted the power sharing government many years, even after the apartheid. ANC believed that it will slow down the real democracy because the minority government will still keep too much power in the government. Also, the political violence also contributed to the failure of CODESA 2. There was still a lot of violence in the country between political groups. many people were being killed in a political conflict, which created anger and mistrust during the negotiations. The ANC walked out of the negotiations process, and then they called for a rolling mass actions. This threatens the process of negotiations. So let me summarize the CODESA 2. CODESA 2 was a second round of the talk for the democratic South Africa, but it failed because political parties could not agree on the important issues about how South Africa should be governed after the apartheid. The National Party wanted wanted a power sharing government where different political parties can form a one government, just like GNU. And here in South Africa today we have GNU government where we have ANC, PA, DA, and other political parties formed one government. But National Party but ANC wanted a majority rule. And also the political violence also contributed to the failure of CODESA 2, because there was still a lot of violence around the country between political groups, and many people were killed in the political conflict, which created the anger and mistrust during the negotiations. And then ANC decided to leave the negotiations, and then they called a rolling mass action. This threatened the process of the negotiations. The next one, we had the Boipatong massacre. Boipatong massacre was one of the biggest reasons for CODESA 2 to collapse. The Boipatong massacre was one of the biggest reasons for CODESA 2 to collapse. The IFP supporters killed 49 residents in Boipatong, a town outside of Johannesburg. The armed members of IFP residing at the Kwamadala hostel with the police assistance, they attacked the residents of Boipatong. Many people were killed in Boipatong township. ANC believed that the government was involved in the violence. And the reason that ANC believed that the government was involved is because when IFP attacked the residents of Boipatong, they came with the police. So they were assisted by police. So the reason that ANC is saying that ANC believed that government was involved is because of IFP was assisted by police when they attacked Boipatong massacre. Because of this, ANC withdrew from the negotiations. The next one is Bisho massacre. I struggle to pronounce this Xhosa, but it's Opa Tonso, a leader of Ciskei Homeland, was not fully supportive of the national negotiations process. The leader of Ciskei Homeland, Opa, he was not fully supportive to the negotiations process. The reason that Opa did not support the negotiations process is because of that he feared the losing power. He was aware that the national negotiations was against the homeland system. They were against the homeland system. So he feared that he will lose his positions and then he will lose the control over over Ciskei. So because of that, he was not in support of He was not in support of the negotiations process. So about 10,000 of ANC supporters, they marched to Bisho to protest against the leader of Ciskei, Opa, and then they demanded the homeland system to be cancelled. Protesters tried to enter Bisho Stadium, but Ciskei Defense Forces soldiers opened fire on the crowd, and then 28 protesters were killed, and then over 200 people were injured. And then the Bisho massacre in the former homeland of Ciskei, now it's called Eastern Cape. It was one of the most serious incidents of the violence during the transitions period before the democracy. Let me repeat this one. The leader of Ciskei homeland, Opa, was not fully supportive of the negotiations process. The reason that Opa was not fully supportive of the negotiations process is because of he feared that he's going to lose power. He's going to lose power and the control over Ciskei, because the national negotiations met to end the homeland system. So because of he was not fully supportive of the national negotiations process, about 10,000 supporters marched to Bisho to protest against the leader of Ciskei. And then they demanded that the homeland system should be cancelled. The protesters tried to enter the stadium, and then the Ciskei Defense Force soldiers opened fire on the crowd, and then they killed 28 protesters, and then over 200 people were injured. And they are saying that the Bisho massacre in the former homeland of Ciskei, now it's called Eastern Cape, it was one of the most incident of violence during the transitions period before the democracy. And then here we are having the record of understanding. Remember, the negotiations collapsed at Codesa 2. The negotiations collapsed at Codesa 2. So the collapse of negotiations was saved by Cyril Ramaphosa of ANC and Rolf Meyer of National Party. After when the negotiation collapsed, Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer met at a secret place, but they held a secret talk leading to the signing of record of understanding. So when we talk about the record of understanding, here ANC and National Party, they were committing themselves, because no matter what, we are going to continue with the negotiations. So they were committing themselves that even when they have differences, they have to continue with the negotiations. So the record of understanding was an agreement that helped to restart the talk in South Africa. It resolved the problems that had been blocking the negotiations and restored the communications between the ANC and the government. The government, I'm talking about the National Party. And it created a way to continue with the talks towards a democratic settlement. This opened the process of the negotiations once again, and the multi-party process began. Let me go back to the record of understanding again. The record of understanding, this is where the collapse of the negotiations was saved by Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer. Cyril Ramaphosa was representing ANC, and then Rolf Meyer was representing National Party. They had a secret talk leading to the signing of record of understanding. The record of understanding, this is where they were committing themselves that no matter what, they are going to negotiate until South Africa become a democratic country. So the record of understanding was an agreement that helped to restart a talk in South Africa. It resolved the problem that had been blocking the negotiations, also restored communication between ANC and National Party government, and it also created a way for ANC and National Party to continue to talk towards a democratic settlement. So this opened the process of negotiations once again after when the negotiations collapsed at Codesa 2, and then the multi-party process began. However, the issue of interim government remained unsolved. Remember, when we talk about the interim government, we are talking whereby National Party wanted a power-sharing government, while the ANC wanted a majority rule government. So, because of the issue of interim government to remain unsolved, John Slow solved the issue of interim government and the fear of white minority. White people fear that after the apartheid, they're going to lose power completely. So John Slow came up with the sunset clause. He proposed a government of unity. Remember, the reason that the Codesa 2 failed is because of the National Party demanded a power sharing, while ANC demanded a majority rule. But here, John Slough was representing ANC. To solve the issue of interim government, he proposed a government of unity, GNU. Government of unity is whereby different political parties form a one government. For example, in South Africa now, we have the president from ANC, we have the deputy president from ANC, we have the minister of sports from PA, we also have the minister of agriculture from ANC, we also have like the deputy president of military from UDM. So that is a government of unity. So since John Slough proposed the government of unity to try to solve the issue of interim government, which allowed a power sharing. So white were also promised that they are going to hold a key positions in the new government afterward, after the apartheid. John Slough proposed the government of unity, which will allow a power sharing where political parties are going to share power. And then they also promised white people that are going, they also promised white people that they were also going to hold key positions in the new government. And then government employee will keep their job for 10 years even after the new government was introduced. The government employee were promised that will keep their jobs for 10 years even after the new government was introduced. The apartheid government feared losing power completely, but the sunset clause was very, very important in the negotiations because it gave confidence to both ANC and National Party to continue with the negotiations and also to reduce a fear about a political change. And it helped to ensure the peaceful and stable transitions to democracy. So John Slough came up with the sunset clause because of he was trying to solve the issue of interim government, which remained unsolved after when Codesa II failed. So to solve the issue of interim government, he proposed the government of unity, which allowed power sharing government. And then they also promised white people that they were going to hold key positions in the new government. And government employees were also promised that they will keep their jobs for 10 years, even after the new government was introduced. And then the apartheid government feared losing power completely. But the sunset clause was important in the negotiations because it gave confidence to ANC and National Party to continue with the negotiations. Also to reduce fears about political change. And it helped to ensure that peaceful and stable transitions to a democracy. After the sunset clause, we had the assassination of Chris Hani. The assassination of Chris Hani was a major turning point in South African transitions to democracy. They are saying that the assassination of Chris Hani was a major turning point in South Africans' transitions to democracy. Chris Hani was a senior leader of ANC, was a commander of Umkhonto weSizwe, and a leader of South African Communist Party. And he was very popular among young people and the township communities. So the assassination of Chris Hani was a turning point in South Africans' transitions to democracy. Chris Hani was a senior member of ANC. He was a commander of Umkhonto weSizwe. He was also a leader of South African Communist Party, and he was very popular to young people in South Africa, and he was very popular in the township of South Africa. On the 10th of April 1993, Chris Hani was shot and killed outside of his home in Bosbeck. His death caused a widespread shock, anger across the country. It led to a large protest and unrest in South Africa, and many people feared that it could result in the civil war. De Klerk called Nelson Mandela to help to control the crisis after Chris Hani was assassinated. Also to prevent the violence. also to protect the negotiations process towards the democracy. De Klerk was afraid that it could result in the civil war, so he called Nelson Mandela to help to prevent the violence, also to protect the continuation of the negotiations towards a democracy. Mandela called for a peace, and then he urged that public to remain calm. He asked people not to respond with their revenge or violence. The assassination of Chris Hani was a turning point because it brought South Africa too close to a violent and collapse. But it also pushed the leaders to speed up the negotiations process and to move more urgently towards the democracy. So the assassination of Chris Hani was a turning point in the South African transitions to democracy. Why? Because after when Chris Hani was killed, his death caused a widespread shock and anger across the country. Black people were not happy that Chris Hani was killed by white people, because the people who killed Chris Hani were white people. It led to a large protest and unrest in South Africa, and many people feared that it could result in the civil war. So to avoid a civil war, de Klerk called Nelson Mandela for help, to help the crisis, or to help to prevent to prevent the violence in the country, also to protect the negotiations towards a democracy. Nelson Mandela asked people to calm down, and then he also asked people to not to respond with a revenge or a violence. So the assassination of Chris Hani was a turning point because it brought South African close to a violence, also to collapse. But it also pushed the leaders to speed up the negotiations and to move more urgently towards a democracy. After the assassination of Chris Hani, the multi-party negotiations forum was formed in 1993 after when CODESA failed. Remember, CODESA 2 failed after they formed the multi-party negotiating forum in 1993. It was created to continue with the negotiations towards a democracy in South Africa. It was created to continue with the negotiations towards democracy in South Africa. Some right-wing groups, including AWP, rejected the negotiations. They used the violence and intimidations to oppose a democratic change. When we talk about AWP, these were the group of white people who were against the negotiations. They were against the negotiations process. They wanted to maintain the white privilege. The multi-party forum was formed to continue with the negotiations, but some groups such as AWP rejected the negotiations, and they used the violence to oppose a democratic change. The reason that they rejected the negotiations using the violence is because of they wanted to keep or to maintain their white privileges. Despite this opposition, the multi-party negotiating forum continued with the negotiations and to develop a new constitution, also to promote peace, also to prepare South Africa for a democratic elections. However, this did not stop the negotiating parties from coming up with the new date for the elections, which was the 27th of April 1994. So the multi-party negotiating forum was formed after when the CODESA 2 failed. It was formed so that they can continue with the negotiations, but there were some groups such as AWB that rejected the negotiations, and they used the violence to oppose a democratic change. And then the reason that they were against the negotiations process is because of they wanted to maintain the white privilege. But even though AWP tried to disturb the negotiations, they continued with the negotiations, and then they managed to develop a new constitution. They managed to promote the peace. They have managed to prepare South Africa for a democratic elections. Even though AWB tried to disturb the negotiations, that did not stop the negotiating parties from coming up with the election date, which was the 27th of April 1997. 1994. Apologies. And then after MPNF, we had the violence at St. James Church. The St. James Church massacre took place on the 25th July 1993 in Cape Town, when the members of Pan-Africanist Congress, armed wing, the Azanian People's Liberation Army, attacked church service using what? Using guns. Remember, PAC did not attend CODESA 1 because of they were against the negotiations. They did not even attend CODESA 2 because of they were against what? Against the negotiations. So here they attacked church members at St. James Church, trying to disturb the negotiations to continue. Using what? Using gun. So 11 people were killed and the many others were injured. The attack caused a national shock, and it increased a fear because civilians were attacked in the place of worship. PAC was against the negotiations. So to disturb the negotiations, they attacked church members at St. James Church in Cape Town on the 25th July 1993. And then they killed 11 people, and the many other people were injured. And then this attack caused a national shock, and it increased the fear because civilians were targeted in the place of worship. Many people feared that such attacks could collapse the negotiations process and led to a further violence and even a civil war. After when PAC armed wing attacked members at St. James Church, many people feared that these such attacks could collapse the negotiations process, and it will also lead to a further violence, even the civil war. We also had the Shell House massacre. The Shell House massacre took place on the 28th March 1994, before the elections in Johannesburg, during the final stage of South Africa's transitions to democracy. The Shell House massacre took place on the 28th of March 1994 in Johannesburg, during the final stage of South African transitions to democracy. Supporters of Inkatha Freedom of Party were marching in the city of Johannesburg when they approached a Shell House, the headquarters of African National Congress. So the supporters of IFP were marching in the city of Johannesburg, and then when they approached the Shell House, the headquarters of ANC, the ANC secret guards opened fire on the crowd, and about 19 people were killed. The incident increased tensions and fear just before 1994 elections. It threatens the negotiations because it shows that fighting between the political groups was still happening, which could reduce a trust in the peace process and to put the upcoming democratic elections at risk. So the Shell House massacre, it's whereby supporters of supporters of Inkatha Freedom of Party were marching in the city of Johannesburg, and then when they approached the Shell House, which was the headquarters of ANC, the secret guard of ANC opened fire on the crowd, and then they killed 19 people. So this incident increased the tensions and the fear just before 1994 elections. It also threatens the negotiations because it shows that fighting between political groups was still happening, which could reduce a trust in the peace process. Also to put the upcoming democratic elections at risk. The next one, here we are discussing the elections. The South African general elections were held on April 27 of April 1994, and this marked the end of apartheid and the beginning of a democratic South Africa. For the first time, all South Africans, or for the first time, all South Africans of all race were allowed to vote, and more than 20 million participated. 20 million people participated, and the elections were organized and monitored by IEC to ensure that they were free and fair. The ANC won the majority of vote. Nelson Mandela became the first democratic president of South Africa. These elections were important because they ended apartheid and established a new democratic government based on equality and the majority role in South Africa. So I want to go back and summarize everything before we can go to essay writing skill. We started by explaining the change of leadership. The change of leadership is whereby de Klerk replaced P.W. Botha after when P.W. Botha suffered a stroke. But de Klerk had a different belief with the previous apartheid president. De Klerk believed that apartheid could not continue because it was causing violence and the protest and the economic problems in South Africa. Because of that, de Klerk realized that the black people had to be included in politics because apartheid was no longer working. So he wanted to have also to avoid a civil war, also to avoid a violence between political groups and government. De Klerk believes that negotiations could bring peace. So de Klerk replaced Botha as a president, and then de Klerk believes that apartheid could not continue because of it was causing problems in South Africa, such as violence, protest, and economic problems. So because of that, de Klerk realized that black people had to be included in politics because apartheid was no longer working. And he also wanted to avoid a civil war. He also wanted to avoid a violence between political groups and government. De Klerk believes that the negotiations could bring peace in South Africa. And then on the 2 of February 1990, de Klerk opened the parliament, and his speech changed the course of South Africa because in his speech he promised that he's going to unban ANC, PAC, and South African Communist Party so that they can start with the negotiations. Because without unbanning of ANC and PAC, negotiations wouldn't happen. So he promised that he's going to unban ANC and PAC and South African Communist Party so that they can start with the negotiations for a democratic South Africa. He also promised that he's going to release all the political prisoners. Political prisoners are those who were arrested because of they were fighting for the rights of black people, not just they committed a crime. And then he also promised that he's going to release Nelson Mandela unconditionally. And this was the beginning of the end of apartheid government in South Africa. After the speech, as he promised that he's going to release Nelson Mandela unconditional, on the 11th of February 1990, Nelson Mandela was released unconditional from Victor Verster prison. And after when Nelson Mandela was released from the prison, he met with the senior members of ANC to brief them about the upcoming negotiations. So they discussed, Mandela and other ANC senior members, they discussed about the future of South Africa. They spoke about the ending of apartheid in South Africa peacefully without using a violence. They plan on how ANC will take part in the negotiations with the government. Also, Mandela in this meeting encouraged the peace, unity, and cooperation instead of using a violence. Mandela had shown a brilliant leadership and commitment to participate in the negotiations. Before the negotiations can start or the talk can start between ANC and National Party, in the beginning of the negotiations, was postponed because of the violence in Sebokeng. ANC and National Party had to postpone the first talk because of the violence in Sebokeng, whereby 8 protesters were killed and 40 people were injured. Afterward, 50 protesters held a peaceful march to protest against the higher rent and the poor living conditions, where the police officers opened fire on the crowd with the rubber bullet and tear gas, and then 8 protesters were killed and 400 were injured. This had an effect on the negotiations because it happened soon after when Nelson Mandela was released. ANC as a government, as an organization, they were not happy about this, and then they were willing even to stop the negotiations for a while. But Nelson Mandela and de Klerk had to meet quickly to calm down the situation, and they also to set a new date for the negotiations. So finally, the first meeting between National Party and ANC took place at the Grooteskier. The main role players in the meeting were Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. The aim of the first meeting was to end the violence, also to commit themselves towards the process of the negotiations. In this meeting, National Party agreed to suspend or to lift the state of emergency, but not in KwaZulu-Natal. They also agreed to scrap the Separate Amenities Act. I explained the Separate Amenities Act because it was that act whereby it used to divide black and white. For example, toilet for white, toilet for blacks, schools for white, schools for blacks. So in this meeting, they agreed to scrap the Separate Amenities Act. They also agreed that political prisoners were to be released. But in this meeting, ANC refused to suspend Umkhonto weSizwe. But ANC called overseas countries to drop the boycott against South Africa. And then ANC and National Party met again at the Pretoria Minute. In this meeting, the National Party now agreed to scrap all the remaining apartheid laws. Remember, in the first meeting, they only agreed to scrap Separate Amenities Act. But in the second meeting, the National Party agreed to scrap all the remaining laws. They also agreed to lift the state of emergency in KwaZulu-Natal. On the other hand, ANC agreed to suspend the armed struggle. Both political parties also agreed to release political prisoners gradually. Both political parties agreed to continue peacefully negotiations for the democracy. The next one, this is where the IFP hostel residents attacked ANC supporters in Vaal. The IFP, as a political party, was against the negotiations. So they attacked the ANC supporters in Vaal, and then they killed 30 people in the attack. This violence made political talks even more difficult. But even though IFP attacked the ANC supporters, Nelson Mandela and de Klerk did not stop negotiating because of they were committed to the negotiations. So Nelson Mandela and de Klerk commitment allowed the negotiations process to do what? To continue, even though IFP tried to derail the negotiations. And then Codesa 1. Here, the Codesa 1 was the first major meeting to discuss the democratic South Africa. The reason that this was the major meeting is because 19 political parties attended Codesa 1 to discuss South Africans' future. Remember, in the first meeting and second meeting, it was only ANC and National Party. But at Codesa 1, 19 political parties attended. PAC and CP did not attend Codesa 1 because they did not agree with the process of negotiations, meaning that they were against the negotiations. Also, IFP leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi did not attend CODESA 1, but the party sent someone to represent IFP. So even though PAC and CP and IFP tried to block the process of negotiations, ANC and National Party proposed the declaration of intent. When we talk about the declaration of intent, it's where it's where political parties sign to agree that they are going to work together towards a democratic South Africa. They also promise that they are going to solve the problem without using a violence. They also agree that they are going to respect a human rights and equality. They also supported the new idea of a new constitution in South Africa. So it was signed by major political parties, including African National Congress and the government led by F.W. de Klerk. Of the 19 political parties, remember 19 political parties attended CODESA 1. So meaning that only 17 political parties signed the declaration of intent, because IFP and Putatswana did not sign the declaration of intent. But just because of like 17 political parties signed the declaration of intent, the declaration of intent allowed the negotiations to do what? To continue. Right after the CODESA 1, remember I said CODESA 1 was a success. National Party began to lose power, especially among white voters. So because of like the National Party was losing power, or was losing supporters, de Klerk called on white-only referendum to check or to test white people whether if they were supporting his reforms to end apartheid, also to negotiate with ANC or not. So he called a white-only referendum to check whether if white people were supporting him on the reforms of ending apartheid, also with the negotiations with the National Party. So only white people were allowed to vote yes or no. But majority of white voters voted yes, meaning that they were supporting de Klerk to continue with the negotiations with ANC, also to end the apartheid. Even though National Party was losing power, majority of white people, the reason we're saying majority is because of 68% voted yes to allow de Klerk to continue with the negotiations, to allow de Klerk to continue with the process of ending what? The apartheid. Because of like 68% of white voters voted yes, de Klerk continue with the reforms. Which it shows that many white voters accepted what? The change. After the white-only referendum, we had CODESA 2. CODESA 2 was a second round of talk for the democratic South Africa. But CODESA 2 failed because political parties did not agree on the important issues about how South Africa should be governed after the apartheid. The National Party wanted South Africa to, they wanted a government of power sharing, while ANC wanted a new government to be based on the majority rule. A majority rule is only one party that will make rules in the country. But National Party wanted a power sharing where many political parties formed one government, different ministers coming from different political parties. But they could not agree on how the new constitution will be made, because ANC wanted something else, National Party wanted something else. National Party wanted the power sharing, while the ANC wanted the majority rule. So because of that, they could not agree on the new constitution. Constitution will be made. So this made CODESA 2 to fail. Also, the other thing that made CODESA 2 to fail is because of the political violence. There was still a lot of political violence around the country between political groups. Many people were being killed in the political conflict, which created anger and mistrust during the negotiations. ANC decided to walk out of the negotiations process, and then they called a rolling mass action. This threatened the negotiations this threatens the process of the negotiations. So the reason that CODESA 2 was a failure is because of like ANC and National Party did not agree on how the new government on how South Africa should be governed after what? After the apartheid. As National Party wanted the power sharing, as the ANC wanted majority rule. Also, the political violence contributed to the failure of CODESA 1, of CODESA 2, because of there was still a lot of violence in the country between political groups like ANC and IFP. So many people were killed in the political conflict, and this created anger and mistrust during the negotiations. Because of this, ANC worked out of the negotiations process, and then they called a rolling mass action, and this threatens the process of negotiations. After CODESA 2, there was a Buipatong massacre. The Buipatong massacre was one of the biggest reasons for the failure of CODESA 2. Here, IFP supporters attacked and killed 49 residents in Buipatong, a township outside of Johannesburg. The armed members of IFP residing at Kwamadala Hostel with the police assistance attacked the residents of Buipatong. So meaning that IFP was getting a support from the police. Because of this, ANC believed that government was involved in the negotiation, in the violence. The reason that ANC believed that the government was involved in the violence is because of when the IFP supporters attacked the residents in Buipatong, they were assisted by the police. And because of this, ANC withdrew from the negotiations. And then we had Bisho massacre. The leader of Homeland, Opa, Khonto, something like that. I struggle to pronounce this name. The leader of Sinskei Homeland was not fully supportive of the national negotiations process. He was against the negotiations. The leader of Sinskei Homeland was against what? Negotiations. The reason that he was against the negotiations is because of he knew that he's going to lose power. Because of the national negotiations meant to end the homeland system in South Africa. So he feared that he will lose his positions in the Ciskei homeland, and he's going to lose a control over over Ciskei. So because of that, he was against the negotiations. So because of Opa as a homeland leader was against the negotiations, the 10,000 supporters of ANC, they decided to head a peaceful march to Bisho. They were protesting against the leader. The reason that they were protesting against the leader of Sinskei is because of the leader of Sinskei was against the negotiations. And the ANC supporters, they were demanding the homeland system to be cancelled. And then when the protesters tried to enter the stadium, the Ciskei Defense Force soldiers opened fire on the crowd. And then they killed 25 of protesters, and over 200 people were injured. And the Bisho massacre was in the former homeland of Ciskei, now it's Eastern Cape. It was one of the most serious incident of violence during the transitions period before the democracy. So the reason that the ANC supporters had a peaceful march to Bisho is because of they were protesting against the Opa, the leader of Ciskei, as he was against the negotiations. They also demanding that the homeland system should be cancelled. Because of Opa was not happy with the demands of the protesters. When the protesters entered the stadium, Ciskei Defense Force soldiers opened fire on the crowd, and they killed 28 protesters, and 200 people were injured. Okay? The record of understanding. Remember, we talked about CODESA 2, where we said the CODESA 2 failed due to disagreement between ANC and National Party. Also, the political violence around Around the country. But to save the negotiations, Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer met in the secret place to sign the record of understanding. They met to sign the record of understanding. The record of understanding is whereby they were committing themselves to continue with the negotiations, committing themselves that no matter what, they are going to negotiate. So in the record of understanding, this was the agreement that helped to to restart a talk in South Africa, also to resolve the problems that had been blocking the negotiations. It also restored the communication between ANC and the government. It also created a way to continue with the negotiations process. And this opened the process of what the record of understanding opened the process of negotiations once again, and then the multi-party process began. However, the issue of interim government remained unsolved. Remember, Codesa 2, this issue of interim government was not solved at Codesa 2 because Codesa 2 failed due to the disagreement. So to solve the issue of interim government, John Slovo proposed the sunset clause. The sunset clause, it's whereby John Slovo proposed the government of national unity, which allowed a power sharing. To solve the issue of interim government, John Slovo proposed a government of unity, which will allow a power sharing for the first 5 years of government, meaning from 1994 until 1999. You see, a national party wanted a power sharing government for many years, even after the apartheid. But John Slovo proposed the government of unity only for the first 5 years of a democratic South Africa. And he also promised white people that they are going to keep their positions in the new government. Even the government employee will keep their jobs for at least 10 years after the new government was introduced. Because of this, because of the sunset clause, it gave confidence to ANC and National Party to continue with the negotiations, because the National Party feared that it reduced the fear about the political changes. National Party feared of losing power completely after 1990, after the democratic government. So to solve that, John Slovo proposed the government of unity, which will allow National Party to work together with ANC for at least first 5 years of a democratic government. And this helped to ensure the peaceful and stable transitions to democracy, because it reduced the fear about the political change. Which political change? Whereby the apartheid government feared of losing power completely. And then, after the sunset clause, Chris Hani was assassinated. After when Chris Hani was assassinated outside of his home in Bosberg, his death caused a widespread shock and anger across the country, and it led to a large protest around South Africa, also unrest, and many people feared that it could result in the civil war. So to avoid a civil war, de Klerk called Nelson Mandela to help to control the crisis after the Chris Hani assassination, also to prevent the violence, also to protect the negotiations process. Nelson Mandela called for a peace, and then he urged public to do what? To remain calm. He asked people not to respond with the revenge or to use a violence, because they were in the process of negotiations. And then the assassination of Chris Hani, the reason that they are saying the assassination of Chris Hani was a turning point is because it's brought South Africa too close to a violence or too close to a civil war, also to collapse the negotiations process. But it's also pushed the leaders to speed up the negotiations, also to move more urgently towards the democracy. And then after the assassination of Chris Hani, the MPNF, which is a multi-party negotiations forum, was formed in 1993 to replace CODESA. So it was formed. It was formed because they wanted to continue with the negotiations towards a democracy in South Africa. So MPNF was formed to continue with the negotiations in South Africa. But there were some right-wing groups that were against the negotiations, such as AWB. AWB rejected the negotiations, and then they used the violence and intimidations to oppose the democratic change. When we talk about AWB, here we're talking about the group of white people who wanted to maintain the white privilege in South Africa, meaning that they were in support of apartheid policies in South Africa. So even though AWB rejected the negotiations, the multi-party negotiation forum continue with the negotiations to develop the new constitutions, also to promote a peace, also to prepare South Africa for what? For a democratic elections. However, the rejections of, the AWB trying to reject the negotiations did not stop the negotiating parties from coming up with the election date, which was the 27th of April 1994. So after when they came up with the date of the election, still the PAC armed wing, Azanian People Liberation Army, attacked a church service using what? Using guns. Remember, PAC did not even attend Codesa 1 because of they were against what? They were against the negotiations. So to try to disturb the negotiations, they attacked church members at St. James Church. And then they killed 11 church members, and then many other members were injured. This attack caused a national shock, and it increased the fear because civilians were targeted in the place of worship. Many people feared that that such attacks could collapse the negotiations process, also led to a further negotiations or even a civil war. So after the St. James Church massacre, we had a Shell House massacre, whereby IFP supporters were marching in the city of Johannesburg. When they approached the Shell House was it's a headquarter of ANC. When they were approaching the Shell House, the ANC secret guard opened fire on the crowd, and then they killed 19 people. And then this incident increased the tensions and the fear just before 1994 elections. It threatens the negotiations because it shows that the fighting between political groups such as it threatens the negotiations because it shows that a fighting between political groups was still happening in South Africa, which could reduce the trust in the peace process and to put the upcoming democratic elections at risk. But the violences at Shell Garage, St. James Church did not stop the elections because the elections were held on the 27th of April 1994, and this was marked as the end of apartheid and the beginning of the new democratic South Africa. For the first time, all South Africans of all race were allowed to vote. More than 20 million people participated. The elections were organized and monitored by IEC to ensure that they were fair and free. ANC won the majority of vote. Nelson Mandela became the first president of a democratic South Africa. These elections were important because it ended apartheid and it established a new democratic government based on the equality and a majority rule. Now I want us to discuss the essay writing skills in history. The essay writing skills in history. In history essay writing, there are three main aspects. We have introduction, we have body, we also have conclusion. So whenever we write history essay, we have to write the introduction first. After introduction is body, after body is conclusion. But we also have, in the introduction, we also have three aspects, which is a stance, content, and the line of argument. So meaning whenever you have to write the introduction, you have to start with the stance. After writing a stance, you have to provide a content. After providing a content, you have to provide a line of argument. So a stance, when we talk about a stance, we are talking about your position. Obviously, like they are going to give you a question statement. So you have to tell a marker or a reader whether if you agree with the statement or disagree with the statement. That is your stance. So meaning you're going to disagree or agree with the statement, and then after you're going to repeat what the statement. After when you are done with that, you are going to provide a content that is going to support your stance. The content that you're going to provide here, it's a content that is going to provide what? I mean, that is going to support your stance. After providing a content, I'm expecting to see what? The line of argument. Tell the reader what you're going to discuss in your essay. In your introduction, you're going to include a stance where you will be telling the reader or the marker whether you agree or disagree with the statement, the question statement. And then after that, you're going to provide a content the content that is going to support your stance. After providing a content, you're going to provide a line of argument. In the line of argument, you are telling a marker what are you going to discuss on your essay. And then now we go to a body. In history essay, learners used a peel method when they are writing a body paragraph. The peel method helps a learner to write clear, organized, and well-supported paragraph. So when we talk about the peel method, we are talking about a point, evidence, explanation, and a link. So a point, it's where you state the main idea of the paragraph. On the point, it's where you state what the main idea of the paragraph. Evidence, you provide a historical fact or example or evidence to support your point. On the point, you state the main idea of the paragraph. Evidence, which is another E, you provide historical fact, example, or evidence to support your point. Explanation, you explain how the evidence support you explain how the evidence supports the point. And then the link, you link the paragraph back to the essay question or, oh yes, I made a mistake. When you link the paragraph back to the essay question, the given question. So the first P is a point. You state the main idea of the paragraph. First E, it's evidence, where you provide historical fact or example or evidence to support your point. E, the other E is for explanation, whereby you explain how the evidence support the point. The last one is link, where you link the paragraph back to essay question. And then we have conclusion. In history, when you write conclusion, we must refer. By conclusion, your conclusion must refer back to the essay question, and they use the content. And then after when you refer back to the essay question, you are going to use the content to discuss or to support your argument. Also, you are going to include a personal judgment or a final solution. And then here, please avoid introducing a new information. In the conclusion, we don't introduce a new information. We refer back to the question. We use the content to support the argument. Also, you include a personal view. But remember, even when you include a personal view or a personal judgment, you don't add new information. Avoid introducing a new information in the introduction. In the conclusion. So I came up with the example on how to write an introduction. I came up with this statement. The statement is saying Nelson Mandela was the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa in 1994. The statement is saying Nelson Mandela was the only leader responsible for sustaining a negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa in 1994. critical discuss the statement. Remember, in a question of critical, the reason I chose the critical discuss is because of here, we have to show two sides of the story. This is where you show two sides of the story. So when I take a stance, I said Nelson Mandela was not the only leader. This is how I have taken my stance. I said Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic South Africa in 1994. My stance is saying Nelson Mandela was not, because the question statement is saying Nelson Mandela was the only leader. So when I take a stance, I said was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa in 1994. The reason that I'm saying he was not the only leader, my content, I said because there were other leaders who also contributed to sustaining the negotiations process, such as Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, when they signed the Record of Understanding. The reason that I don't agree with the statement that Nelson Mandela was the only leader is because of there were other leaders who also contributed to sustaining the negotiations process, such as Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, when they signed the Record of Understanding, which saved the negotiations after the collapse of CODESA 2. The reason that I don't agree with the statement that Nelson Mandela was the only leader is because of there were other leaders, even de Klerk. De Klerk played a role when he had banned political parties, which contributed to sustaining the negotiations process, which ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa. Some will say the reason that they don't agree with the question statement that Nelson Mandela was the only leader is because of 19 political parties attended CODESA 1. And they signed the declaration of intent, which also contributed for sustaining the negotiations process, which ultimately led to a democratic Republic of South Africa in 1994. So, after taking a stance, I said Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa in 1994. The reason that I don't agree is because there were other leaders who also contributed to sustaining the negotiations process, such as Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, when they signed the Record of Understanding. But remember, this question, it's a critically discussed. Even when I disagreed with the statement, I must also show the other side of the story, whereby I will be talking about the contributions of Nelson Mandela. So, after when I disagreed with the statement, I disagreed with the statement because of I said there were other leaders who also contributed, such as Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer. And then full stop. And then I said, however, Nelson Mandela also made an important contribution. For example, when he calmed the nation after the assassination of Chris Hani. When I disagree with the statement, that doesn't mean that Nelson Mandela did not contribute. He did contribute, but he was not only leader who was responsible. There were other leaders who were responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic Republic of South Africa. So for me to disagree with the statement is because of there were other leaders such as Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, such as John Slovo, such as 19 political parties that attended CODESA 1, such as de Klerk when he promised to release political prisoners. But just because of I disagreed with the statement, that doesn't mean Nelson Mandela did not contribute. That's why I said, however, Nelson Mandela also also made important contributions. For example, when he calmed the nation after the assassination of Chris Hani. And then my line of argument is saying the below essay or the essay below will further discuss that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. as well as the role players, as well as the role played by other leaders who contributed to the negotiations. So you see, my line of argument is not only focusing on how Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible. I said I am going to discuss that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. As well, I am going also to discuss the role players, the role that was played by other leaders who contributed to the what? To the negotiations. So all in all, my example of the negotiation is like this. Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a new democratic South Africa, because there were other leaders who also contributed to sustaining the negotiations process, such as Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer, when they signed the Record of Understanding. However, Nelson Mandela also made an important contribution. For example, when he calmed the nation down after the assassination of Chris Hani. My line of argument, the below essay will further discuss that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994, as well as the role played by other leaders who contributed to the negotiations. So after the introduction, I made two examples of a link to paragraphs that are not talking about Nelson Mandela, or that are not talking about the contributions of Nelson Mandela. For example, the paragraph that I chose is the one for F.W. de Klerk's speech. It's saying F.W. de Klerk's speech opened the parliament on the 2nd February 1992. His speech changed the directions of South Africa's future. During the speech, he announced that he's going to unban the liberations movement such as an ANC and PAC and SACP. He also stated that political prisoners will be released, including Nelson Mandela, who will be released unconditional. This marked the beginning of the end of apartheid rule. The speech was significant because it opened the way for a peaceful negotiations, and it created an opportunity for political parties to work together towards a democracy. Because of this paragraph is not talking about the contributions of Nelson Mandela. Now we need to prove that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. When I link this paragraph, I said, therefore, this paragraph proves that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. Because de Klerk also played an important role by unbanning political organizations and releasing political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. So this paragraph is not talking about the contribution of Nelson Mandela. So because of this paragraph is not talking about the contributions of Nelson Mandela in sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa, you need to prove that he was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process. When I prove it, I say, therefore, this paragraph proves that Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994. Because de Klerk also played an important role by unbanning political organizations and releasing political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. So for de Klerk to release Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners and to unban political prisoners, meaning that he also contributed to sustain the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa. And then the next paragraph, this one is talking about the contributions of Nelson Mandela. Remember, when I have taken my stance, I said he was not, but I also acknowledged his contribution, even though he was not the only leader, but I acknowledged his his contributions in sustaining the negotiations process. Okay, this paragraph is talking about the assassination of Chris Hani was the major turning point in South Africa's transitions democracy. Chris Hani was a senior leader of ANC and the commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe and the leader of South African Communist Party. He was also very popular among young people and even in the township communities. On the 10th of April 1993, Chris Hani was shot and killed outside of his home. His death caused a widespread shock and anger across the country, leading to large protest and unrest in South Africa. Many people feared that the country could fall into a civil war. FW de Klerk called Nelson Mandela to help to control the crisis, also to prevent the violence, also to protect the negotiations process. Nelson Mandela then was called for peace, and then Nelson Mandela and then called for peace, and then he urged the public to remain calm and not to respond with a revenge or violence. The assassination of Chris Hani became a turning point because it brought South Africans too close to violent, also instability. And it also pushed political leaders to speed up with the negotiations and to move more urgently towards a democracy. So you see, this paragraph is talking about Chris Hani, but there is a contributions of Nelson Mandela. How do we see a contribution of Nelson Mandela? Nelson Mandela managed to calm the nation down after the assassination of Chris Hani. So when I link this paragraph, I say, therefore, although Nelson Mandela was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations process that ultimately led to a democratic South Africa in 1994, he played an important role in sustaining the negotiations by helping to calm the nation and to prevent a violence, also to protect the negotiations process. Towards the democracy. So I did not just jump this paragraph because of when I took a stance, I said he was not the only leader. The moment when I say he was not the only leader, that doesn't mean that he did not contribute. He did contribute, but he was not only leader responsible. There were also other leaders who were responsible. So in this paragraph of Chris Hani, he contributed because he managed to calm the nation down. He managed to prevent a violence. He managed to protect a negotiations process. So in this, I said, although he was not the only leader responsible for sustaining the negotiations, he also played an important role in sustaining the negotiations by helping to calm the nation, also to prevent a violence, also to protect the negotiations process towards a democracy. The last one is the example of the conclusion using the same statement. I said, in conclusion, although Nelson Mandela played an important role in sustaining the negotiations process that led to a democratic South Africa in 1994, he was not the only leader responsible for its success. Other leaders such as de Klerk, Ramaphosa, Rolf Meyer, and John Slovo also made important contribution to the negotiations process. Therefore, South Africa's transitions to democracy was achieved through the combined effort of many political leaders and organizations working together towards peace and democracy. So I have referred back to the statement when I say, although Nelson Mandela played an important role in sustaining the negotiations process that led to a democratic South Africa, but he was not the only leader responsible for its success. Other leaders such as Ramaphosa, Rolf Meyer, and de Klerk and John Slovo also made important contribution to the negotiation process. Therefore, South Africa's transitions to democracy was achieved through the combined efforts of many political leaders and organizations working together towards peaceful and democracy. This is how I finish my presentation. I thank you. Nakensa, ngiyabonga, inkosi, ngiyalibua, Kastswana, ngiyalibua iBingasipedi. In Venda, Ndulibua, in Venda, in Devele, Ndiatokoza, in Swati, Ndiabonga, Afrikaans, Danki, English. Thank you.